Hello, and welcome to Credibly Challenged, a podcast on bank risk management. My name is Matt Bisanz, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's DC office focusing on bank regulation. I am joined today by Jason Cave, a former regulator who has now turned his arts to helping the industry understand those regulations and operate under them. He has a wide range of experience across, I'd say, many sectors at the FDIC and FHFA. So, really, everything a consumer or business would need, he has probably touched on it at some point. Thanks for joining us today, Jason.
Great to be here. And I love the name of the podcast, Credibly Challenged. That is, as a regulator, that is so cool. So thanks for having me.
Great. Well, to jump right into it, I think one item that you've been working a lot on that I'd like to hear more about, because it's something that, at least for lawyers, has tailored off in recent years, is around resolution planning and recovery planning. That there's a lot of stuff that's come out of the FDIC on it. I think we've seen some proposals out of the OCC, the thing I have to ask just is, would any of this have made a difference for the banks that failed last year?
No, great question. And clearly there's been the flurry of activities that is pretty common after you have the sort of crisis that we experienced. I think a lot of what has been put in place in the IDI final rule. First, it's important to know that IDI final rule that Marty Grunberg was able to get through the FDIC board, probably one of the most challenging periods of his career. And after I think he announced his resignation, he was still able to get that over the goal line, which was a big deal. You know, Marty was really committed to the IDI plan process for well over a decade. I think that has it will help. It will help at least get banks in the right mindset for getting ready for what potential life might be in a failure. So many times people are like, yeah, of course we'll do that. But the reality is most are like, I'll be gone.
Yes.
Why do I, yeah, I might, and so to really get people to focus on that is key. And I think what's key with the IDI plan is to really remind people that while the resolution planning efforts that have been going on for over a decade are of critical importance, we all know is that there's a reason why they call all these things legal entities. Each of these entities all of a sudden have their own set of lawyers that say, yep, in life we were all together, and in death we are all in some ways on our own, and we need to make sure whatever was going on in our particular operation is going to work. And so I think the IDI plan is really smart in understanding that with all this single point of entry and all these other things that are key, you still have to make sure that's key, because at the end of the day, that's also the entity that is insured. Deposits are insured. So, I think it's going to be helpful. I know there are some clients of yours and that I've talked to too that are like, wait a second, we spent all this time, all these years on single point of entry and solvent wind down, and now all of a sudden we're now going to show a situation where the bank fails. I thought that whole plan was the bank's not going to fail. So you definitely have some of that going on, and I think the FDIC understands that, but there is a reality that you do need to sort of cover the contingencies when some of that doesn't work. So I think that I know that's definitely been a point of concern, not so much just the duplicative manner, but some have raised very good points about, does a good IDI plan potentially undermine single point of entry? That are these things, and I'll talk a little bit about that with the next thing, with recovery planning, because I do think that there's an important point that is being made that, 1 + 1 + 1, is not always 3. In fact, it begins to have to potentially be at odds. And so I think that's an important point. I think that the FDIC, as they implement the plans, they're still going to need to work closely with the Fed and institutions to really make sure that we don't all of a sudden create something that in this box it's okay, but it doesn't work for the rest. So I think that's a good point. Why don't I stop for a second, take a breath?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's interesting that one of the things I've been somewhat vocal on, and I've kept bit my tongue sometimes because I haven't heard other people, and maybe you'll tell me why I'm mistaken on it. But looking back at the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, that the FDIC approached that like it would an emergency receivership. It started off as a DINB. It converted it into a bridge bank once there was the systemic risk exception. But like it played out the way a lot of resolutions have played out over the last 90 years.
Right.
And one of the things I keep asking myself is, you have the orderly liquidation authority under Title II. Why not go, like, if you're going to pull the systemic risk determination, if you're going to get the president and treasury secretary involved, why not go the orderly liquidation authority route, grab the holding company with the asset manager and the other stuff, and then you kind of get some other resources that maybe you don't have at the bank level, and you also avoid some of those, like what you were describing, of inter-entity disputes or intra-group disputes that have come up now around like holding company deposits and like holding company shareholders, that all of that seems to kind of go away in an OLA resolution. And I just wonder, was the FDIC so focused on what it's always done, that it didn't, as you say, coordinate with the Fed or think of those other options?
Yeah. So on that, couple of thoughts. First, speed.
Mm-hmm.
Speed kills.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the FDIC and Fed and OCC and the Bank of England are not talking and not having a lot of time to plan, and so you might be asking a question, heck, everybody knew their unrealized losses swamped capital, so should they have been? That's an important point. My sense was they weren't. They're focused on some other players, and that's a problem with this game. You focus on one, the other one comes out of the blue. So they weren't, from my sense, from what I'm hearing, and I wasn't there, really thinking about that. You got to really, to make the Title II work involves so many actors and the three keys, all those things. You've got to be planning. You got to also have confidence that it could work. This is one of those things. It's great in theory. And, I think there's a lot of players that are going to be turning keys that are still, they like playing simulation land. So you got that. Big one, I think, though, then let's take all those off to the side. I think one of the others, let's look at the structure. So one thing we know with single point of entry, you got to have debt. You got to have a lot of stuff. You got to have a lot of stuff in the right place. And it's got to then also have all the right agreements that follow. Like we know with the big banks, you've been working with all that. There's a lot that goes into that. A lot of those support agreements. I mean, so if you don't have that, and I would venture to guess did not.
Right.
That's going to be a challenge. I also don't think they had a lot of TLAC or any of that at the top. But what we know what they had, and this is, I think, is the most important reason why it wouldn't have worked. So what we know what they had is they had a lot of uninsured deposits at the bank level. That in a situation where you're not dealing with the systemic risk under the least cost test, that stuff's supposed to absorb losses. And if you don't deal with that issue, you got a problem. And I think that's the other issue. You have, I think probably say, you had loss absorbing capacity at all the wrong places. So I think it was a perfect example of why that couldn't work and why they pretty much had to do what they did, which was, again, you're right, the DINB. A lot of people don't get it. It goes to show you what a nerd you are. You actually understood the first thing was not a bridge bank. I'll tell you right now, a lot of your brethren didn't know that.
Yeah. I was very, very briefly at the FDIC when I was in law school, back in the 2008 crisis. And as an intern, they were like, look, we want you to have the full experience, but like we can't pay to do a lot of stuff. So if you want to go on a bank failure, you have to drive yourself there, and you'd better hope it's one that's in the DC area. And I was like, okay, I like sure. And so they're like, we can't really like we can tell you like one's coming, and if you're like willing to like go to this city on this day. And so there's this like Thursday morning that I'm in my little Corolla on the road out past Annapolis, heading out to the eastern shore of Maryland, where I'm going to a Holiday Inn in Easton, Maryland, where the agency is gearing up to execute an insolvency, and I'm with or a receivership, and I'm with like one of my intern leaders, and he's telling me now this one's a little weird. We really tried to sell the bank, but no one wanted it because it's in the middle of nowhere, Maryland. And like we tried everything to sell this bank, but like no one wants this bank in the middle of nowhere. And so we're doing this thing called a DINB, and it's gonna be like we're gonna run it for like 30 or 60 days and pay it off. And that's where I learned about DINBs.
Yeah.
We almost never do these things, but just no one wants this bank. So.
Yeah. It's a very odd little thing, and it's a fancy payoff.
Yes.
That's
yes.
what it really is. Because nobody wants that. And so this is just a shade of it, but it's far from a bridge bank. And so, right, they had to, under the least cost test, when you have great quality assets and a lot of uninsured, the math does not work without, and so the math was clearly geared towards, without a systemic risk exception, to haircutting, and again, there's a lot of different views out there. The FDIC has a lot of authority with advanced dividend payments. People can make things as scary or as not as they want. I mean, the FDIC could have, and again, I'm not saying they should have.
Yeah.
They could have on Monday said, we are not doing a systemic risk exception. We are paying off uninsured depositors an advanced dividend of 90 cents on the dollar. Isn't this great?
Right. Yes.
And then we'll see how the rest goes, because they could have done that.
Right. Right. No.
But anyway, those are the. But I don't think an SPO orderly the way it was organized. And so what this does, I think, is it gives the FDIC what they need to say, this is why our resolution folks need to have resolution plans at the ready for all, institutions above 50 billion. And sometimes I think some of these rules get overly complicated. They start with a simple concept. Sheila Bair and Jim Wigan, this was something they agreed years ago to say, I just want to have a 2-pager on every IDI over 50 billion. What's it look like? What's its structure? What would we do? Simple. Now, I might ask, do they have that? I don't know. What happens then, you write complicated rules for 10 years, but at its core, would it have been helpful to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, say Silicon Valley is set up this way. It has this structure, have this would be difficult. Like, that might have been more helpful than maybe a lot of other things that were done. But you learn that after the fact. I do believe the FDIC will learn from this to say, whatever we do, we need to go back to those basics. Because the issue is you didn't need a 60-page rule to see what you would need on something like that. So hopefully a return to simplicity is part of the plans.
Yes. I laugh at the 2-page one because I think even the simplest bank today, you're right, is going to be many pages. But back during the initial rounds of res planning back in 2014, we had a few foreign banks with U.S. operations that I did them for, and I actually got one of them down to 3 pages. That wow. I was, and it was a very simple structure. But I was like, oh man, I have succeeded here that I got it down, and and then they eventually realized foreign banks with like $15 billion in the U.S. really don't need a resolution plan. But
yeah, right. I mean, that's the sort of thing. Well, unfortunately, I mean, look, I'll tell you. I mean, because of all that 10 billion of assets anywhere, and now we've got branches here and there. I mean, we had to spend years in the beginning just trying to say, how do we make sense of it? So it's like one of those things. You got to be careful with what you wish for. Yeah. But yeah. Now go ahead. Yeah.
One thing on cost though is you were talking about this, and I thought that in my world it comes up a lot with the long-term debt proposal. that in the long-term debt proposal, it's kind of like TLAC, and one of the big changes they proposed was to say, well, you need long-term debt at the bank level and the holding company level, and that basically we want all banks to be funded by their holding companies through long-term debt. Um, and the rationale given, I forget if it was in speeches or something, was we want the optionality of when we're in that like week after the insolvency event under Title II, because we're assuming it's going to be a Title II if we're leveraging a TLAC like situation, that maybe we want to spin the bank free or recap and release the bank, and so we want that optionality. And I've said, well, that's a nice optionality if you're a regulator or a receiver.
Yeah, if you
But
don't pay
what are the costs if you're 50 banks out there who now have to all agree on a single funding model? I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that's a good point. So the costs, I have had now that I'm on the quote unquote other side,
Mm-hmm.
and that the thing that I never had to really think about outside of cost benefit, because of course we do that,
Yes.
was the what's it cost, that optionality. I never had to think about that. Never cared about that. And
Mm-hmm.
now as I'm working with clients, like that matters. Like the foregone revenue stream, because something bad might happen. I'm learning more. Like that's not an academic exercise. There is, and so you're right. I mean, that optionality comes at a cost. I, as a former regulator, I would tell you, I don't think regulators understand that. I also don't think you guys just continuing to write letters about cost benefit is going to make them. So I would also say you have to find another way to do it. I don't think the
Yes.
way you guys have been doing it is compelling.
Right.
I'm happy to think about it as well, but it is an issue, and I don't think regulators fully, again, it's like that's not for them to worry about. They have to be worried about if it doesn't work. And so
Right.
I do think that, all kidding aside,
Yeah.
it's worth thinking about another way to get those points across.
Yeah. Now, I remember it. It was back during the Fed's control rule that we were working on a comment letter for one of the trade associations, and they wanted a very specific fix in the control rule. And we and their members and whatnot workshopped this change, and we took it to the Fed and was like, if you just put this additional page in the regulation, it'll address all of our concerns and whatnot. And they looked at us like we had six heads, because we were saying, like, for our 30, 40 little members, that they should put this specific clause in the control rules. And like they were never going to do that. And they gave us something in the preamble. They actually said in the preamble, we don't think this is a problem because of X, Y, and Z. And it got our members to the same place, and it was great. But I remember thinking, like, oh yes, we really over workshopped that one there. That we had, like, like the indents and the romanettes and stuff, and like that was not what they were looking for as a helpful fix.
Yeah, I mean, I really think, look, what I would say is, on those sorts of issues about the cost, the optionality, you really have to sort of say, optionality is great. We are going to show you with examples how you really don't have optionality here, because these are not choices. There are not three choices you have. You really only have one. And once you go down one, it forecloses the others. And let us show you with examples. And so to sort of say, you don't get optionality, you have the myth of optionality, and yet we have the cost of having to do it. But you actually have to do it like that. I'm not trying, and I get,
Yeah,
like,
no, it's helpful.
you know that, but it's like, it really, I will tell you, with the regulators at these agencies,
Yeah.
if they see those things, they will follow up on it. When people say this is redundant, this is good, they don't care about it. It's like, but if you give those examples and to say things like this will undermine single point of entry, you will get certain people in the agency that care about that to say, well, let's understand that better. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing our listeners probably don't understand as well as they should is recovery planning. That you've got resolution planning, which is holding company 165 Dodd-Frank. Then you've got the IDI rule, which is FDIC specific, and it's for the banks. But then you've also got the OCC's recovery planning guidelines, and there's a proposal out on that. And I think just, can you demystify that whole area for
Yeah,
us?
yeah. So look, the first thing is, as a qualifier, I'm an examiner first, a resolution person second. Again, I came up through the supervision rank. So my whole thing too is, yeah, we want to make sure the bank doesn't fail. Now I learned, in some of my other jobs, and especially with the FDIC, it's like, yeah, but we also really care about when it does, that it's done orderly and that we could actually do it. But I had to I had to come to that second. So for me, I look at the recovery plans and I'm like, this makes perfect sense. If I'm a supervisor, if I'm a true examiner, or if I'm at the OCC, that's what I care about. All this stuff about at failure too, it's sort of like that's somebody else's problem at that point. My main job, Mike Sue his main job is to make sure these banks don't fail. And so, what I see with the recovery plans is really being able to take long held views at OCC and other supervisors and really start to say, we need to get more clear and actionable as to what that means for you guys. So I think it makes a lot of sense. What I think is the challenge is it gets plopped into a process that's already been going for over a decade called resolution planning. And now all of a sudden, if the regulators are not careful, can cause a lot of challenges, I think, for banks. And what I mean by that is, and you don't have to take my word for it. Look at Greg Bear and others. A lot of comments saying, "Wait a second, banks have to serve two masters." And I think right now what you have is Mike Sue and Marty, all these people, they get along, they're voting on everything together, and everybody loves it. But you get even same party, different principles that don't have that kind of thing. And you can have a real challenge. But even before you get there, you have to deal with the staffs. So again, you come up with a recovery plan on the EIC, you start to say, I'm going to start to sell assets. If things get bad in this particular wealth management business, it's in the IDI, I'm going to start selling assets because I can't raise capital. So first good thing is the OCC's now got banks saying, I don't want to just hear how you're going to raise capital. So now they're getting real. So now we start selling assets. Well, the OCC is going to want to see not just the not good stuff. What about the crown jewels?
Yeah.
Great. So you start doing that. Then you find out those crown jewels are tied to the broker dealer. And so we've already told for solvent wind down, we've told the FDIC and Fed, and we've gotten a quote unquote close to credible as we get from them because this solvent wind down is going to work and it's going to take it down. Now you've just told the OCC, yeah, but I'm going to start selling those. How do you start to reconcile? Like, how do you do that? First off, how does the bank do that? How does the OCC, Fed, FDIC work together to say, yeah, we're okay with that, or we're not okay with that? And how's that going to get worked out? So I think about it as a boat. You're in a lifeboat. There's a lot of other stuff. There's cushions, there's people, you're taking on water, it's getting heavy.
Yeah.
And the guy running the boat is saying, we got to start getting rid of some of this weight or we're going to sink. So they start throwing over lifeboats and cushions and they're gone or whatever. Boat sinks. Some of those things would have been, if we were going that direction, we probably would have kept those things. Right. So you have, to me, that very same type of dilemma, and it's a real issue.
Yeah, one thing I think a lot of people forgetting, and you know this very well, is that under the FDIA, there's something like 15 grounds for which the federal regulators can put someone into insolvency or in receivership, and they range from insolvency to, like criminal violations by management, AML violations, and then also they have whatever things for a state bank may be available under state law. But in most, if not almost every resolution, it comes down to the bank became insolvent and that's how you put it into receivership. Like I'm not aware of any bank actually being put into receivership for AML violations, as much as it's been in the
Right.
law for 30 years. When you're an examiner and you're looking at a bank's books and you see something like, hey, they've got 600% CRE and they can't sell it because they've got mark-to-market losses. And this is they're not insolvent on an accounting basis, but like this is something I think is a problem. Or you're looking at, since I maybe get a chance to touch on it, third-party risk management, and you're like, look, this bank has great capital numbers, great earnings numbers, great asset quality, but wow, their third-party risk is off the charts here. I can't believe they haven't had some operational risk like wipe out the bank. How do you how have the regulators managed to avoid hitting, well, I'll just say those 14 other grounds? Like what's the calculus there that makes it almost every resolution is really because of an insolvency?
Sure. There's a couple of things. So first off, and you're right, there are the things that you as a regulator, especially an examiner, you're like, I know this is going to go bad. I can see this is, but I don't have the quote unquote grounds. And you're sort of saying, yes, you do. The reality is all those other grounds have not been used. So it becomes a novel first impression thing. And as you know, even though you were an intern, I'm sure you got the impression from government lawyers, they don't like that. We used to have a lot of battles, and certain principals would say, what if we lose? We ought to go try it. They're like, and then we have precedent. And so you have a lot of people. It's nice to have all that, but they don't want to challenge it. But the other important thing is most banks are still state chartered. And states have a lot of authority. And the states are the agency for state chartered bank that actually closes them. That's how it's supposed to go. And they have their own sets of standards. And they're generally tied to capital or liquidity and solvency. They don't have a lot of those other things. So if you're going in the direction of some of those like AML or others, you are now dealing likely with a self-appointment situation. Which again, FDIC people don't like to do. And the smart FDIC people don't like to do it for one reason. It begins to let the states off the hook. It's not even so much the preemption of it. There's that.
Yeah.
The other issue is it begins to then let states say, you know what, because let's face it, nobody wants to. If you're a state, you don't want to close a bank. I've been on closings. It's not a lot of fun. And so if the FDIC gives you an out, so that whole issue gets tied up into it. And that's why I think there's the practical aspects. State laws don't have it. The states, even if they had it, probably not going to use it. People really, at the end of the day, when they're shut, they want to see capital dissipation. And even liquidity is a tough call. I mean, you have cases and it's like, yeah, it hasn't happened yet. It's like it's going to. Well, when it happens, let us know. So I think that's one of the reasons. So what it's forced regulators to do is to be smarter in consent orders and enforcement actions. And so something that I think your clients and others are probably seeing now is more substantive consent orders that have things such as, you might look like you have enough capital. We don't like where you're going. Sell, merge, or liquidate. That became smarter, like to sort of say, we want you to start looking for partners. Don't wait till the exam comes in. The examiner classifies half your loan book, and now you're insolvent. You don't have options. Start now. And I think that you're seeing probably a lot more of that. And that's smart on the FDIC, OCC, and Fed standpoint, because it also, what that does, Matthew, is it starts the grounds for who's responsible sooner. Because if the FDIC puts it in and then nobody does anything, that's a lot easier to do 80s and lawsuits.
Right. I think back to earlier this year when Republic Bank, the Pennsylvania one, failed. And it was in part because their only strategy had been to sell the bank or get like a full equity buyout, and it turns out no one wanted to buy them. And now I think we're seeing a lot more hugely dilutive, but not full buyouts. There was one, I think, a couple weeks ago in the southern U.S. where some investors came in and took 49% of the equity of a bank. And like, yes, that's hugely painful, but it still is different than if they had come in and bought the bank. And so yeah, it seems like people are getting nudged down that road
Yeah.
quicker.
And I do think, again, where the FDIC is coming from, and I know this has been very controversial, I don't think they finalized it yet, is that a corporate governance proposal. And, I also kind of look at it as maybe this is my opportunity to get on the bank board because, there's a lot to it. And it's at a low standard, $10 billion. But from the FDIC standpoint, is when a bank fails, they're an insurer. They got to recoup. They got losses and they got to recoup them. Otherwise, the fund takes a hit, everybody takes a hit. And you look where the money, you look who's responsible. Well, if you have not given a good basis to why directors and officers should have acted a certain way, and then again, there's what people think they should do, and then there's what they actually are required to do, good luck. Good luck with the insurance companies and all that. So I really believe that this proposal was put out as much for the litigation part of the FDIC. I imagine the head of litigation saying, we're not winning these cases.
Yeah.
It's the same thing like with source of strength. Yeah. Why do you think the FDIC should care more about that? I think if you listen to Steele or others, are like, I don't know why this isn't on agenda 1, 2, and 3. Because without it, and you go in, and the holder can say, that's a taking. Sorry. Yeah. And I can tell you all the times, the head of litigation, we need something more clear that says, that doesn't just have it as a theory. So you have all these things that what's cool about the FDIC is you've got all these other business areas like OCC doesn't have, and so people are like, why are they coming out with that? Why does a supervisor need that? And the answer is, they don't. They might be helpful to them. But I can tell you it's really helpful because when I worked for Shield Bear, we had to run the budget and all that. Like when you start losing money, that's a big deal. Like the FDIC is much more of a business like that. So a lot of these things are coming out to make those parts of it work better.
So before we finish up, I have one more topic I really wanted to cover with you because it's a story I picked up at a conference recently that, Mayer Brown's a law firm, but a lot of people deep inside banks don't know that. I've gotten the question of, oh, you work for Mayer Brown, what city is he the mayor of? And we were at this conference with our booth, and this bank came up and was like, "Hey, what do you guys do?" And
Good thing Jason Kravitz is retired. He would be spitting if he heard that. But anyhow, sorry.
Yes. No. And they were like, "Well, like," and I'm like, and they're like, "Do you guys do like software systems?" And I'm like, "No, not really." They're like, "Okay, we're looking to launch a banking as a service platform." And we need some compliance software that will help us automate a bunch of tasks because like this is going to be our new strategy as a bank. We already have some fintechs onboarded. And right now we have 6 people in our compliance department and we don't want to hire any more as we add on more fintechs. And I pointed them to the row with the software vendors and I wished them well. But I think maybe going to when you're talking about scaling and enforcement actions and stuff, there have been a lot of enforcement actions around third-party risk, and I think some of them have, if you read between the lines, have said something like, you can't onboard more fintechs or get rid of some of your fintech partners. Do you have any thoughts, or can you maybe explain that to our listeners?
Sure. Well, I think you should have said to that person, actually, now that I understand what you want to do, the most important person for you to hire is me, because you're going to need a lawyer. But anyhow, you're nicer than me. But anyway, no, I mean, this is the new world of banking as a service and all of this. And it is, look, people could say, well, post Synapse, the rules are going to change. The rules are already changing. The regulators, some people might say we're ahead of the game. I think the regulators saw, and I heard Mike Sue, he gave a very good speech a year and a half ago, where he said the concern they have is when examiners come in, there's this going on. The bank says we don't have to do that. Talk to this party. The OCC doesn't regulate that party. And then when they even find out, the other party says, well, we don't do that. And so no, and so it's clearly, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that in a big way. What does it mean? Well, first off, what it means is, Durbin gave this nice little break for interchange, and small banks who are having a hard time competing with everybody because everything gets commoditized that they do, this is a revenue stream, a way to not just make money, retain deposits, which are really expensive. So it makes a lot of sense. They're also, I think, finding that, you might beat up on middleware providers, but what was their core doing for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, these things don't get created in a vacuum,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
so you have this, but now you fast forward, now things are getting real. And so when I was a young examiner, the first thing I used to have to do is reconcile correspondent bank accounts, which was a painfully boring thing. But by doing that, I could see if things were sitting in a due from suspense account for 3 months, that was a problem. I think that if examiners were still doing that, some of this would not have happened. And I think what's going on is as examiners start to go back to some of those approaches, and banks were not used to it, they are saying, this doesn't work. You can't run something. So even forgetting the AML and BSA, which I think is important,
Right.
signing up people from that's a problem. There's now, I think, this post-Synapse and with this Evolve going into the transactions. And I think that's going to be very difficult for institutions based if they only have 6 people and it's the same 6 people that do other things.
Right.
Can it be done? People talk about Bancorp, some of these other players, so it could be done. But I think it is like what a lot of people say. I agree. It can't just be a hobby or an additional business line. I think you really have to say, if we're going to do this, we're getting the best people that know how to work this. You can't just rely on software. You can't go to the conference and say, oh, we've got this great thing. And the 3 people that don't know anything, now they do that. No, that's a problem. But I do think that, but at the same time, I actually do think there is a need. I think that some of these fintechs offer products that you can't get from banks, that don't speak the way people speak these days, that when done right, they can provide banks revenue streams. And again, this access to deposits. There's some of these, the Mercuries or others that people don't put their money in banks anymore. And so to be able to get that access to that, you do have to rely on some of these. And I think if the regulators think like everything should just go back to the 1970s,
Right.
and so we're going to keep writing rules until that happens, I don't think that's good. I think that gives incumbents way too much of an advantage to continue to say, yeah, we'll put that platform on in 3 years. So you have that. So I don't think that's real. But I also, for fintechs to sort of say, we have found a way to disrupt the financial system, and it's by not following normal bank rule. That's not going to work either.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like some of these banks with great plans, while they can't just outsource it, they could use the advice of someone like you and your consulting firms that to help understand the mindset and to bring in the people and tools to manage this. That's the kind of thing you give a lot of thought to in your business.
I do, because there is ways to do these things right, and there's a lot of firms out there that are talking about that, and I think that that's what's needed. I saw some of these players saying, I don't know why we have anti-money laundering rules. They're too tough. It's like, let me tell you, and I think that's a bipartisan problem. I don't think you're going to have a whole lot of friendliness in any administration to say, you're right, we really, these pesky know your customer, you're right, I could see why that slows things down. And I got to tell you, I've been reading a lot about this and hearing more about this. Everybody kind of wants to get rid of friction in the system. I think people are starting to realize some of that sand and grit in the things is it's actually pretty good. Like we want to be a little careful when we go. So it's interesting, but I don't see that.
I like to show people on my desk here that it's a wooden debit card that I got from a company about 2 years ago. They're no longer in business. And and it was they mailed it to me overnight in a $50 mailer, even though I paid them $1 to open an account. Most rudimentary. I don't even remember if they got my social, but it was a real debit card that I got in the mail with one of the network logos on it and everything. And I could have, had fun with it, loading it and spending and stuff, but I just wanted it because it was made out of wood. But then I recently opened a high yield savings account at a real bank, and man, you're right, there was friction in it. I like But by the time I got done, I was like 15, 20 minutes into it. I had put in all my information, taken a photo of my driver's license, and I'm like, wow, this is not my experience with the fintech. So yeah, that friction is a different level.
Well, and I'll tell you though, and I've had to do stuff, I'm not going to mention any names, but I've had to do some things with some fintechs recently, and I can tell you the situation has changed. It takes forever now because now what's happening is now the fintechs realize, oh, we actually have to do this stuff. They don't have the scale, they don't have the expertise, and it's painful. And so that's going to be another challenging point is like how to be able for them to now do these things without having the thousands of people in the back office that like an HSBC does, and they're struggling. And I saw this firsthand, and I'm like, this isn't going to work very well. So I think there's going to be a continued disruption. I do think, you know what, the quick thing, I read that third-party community bank guide. It's a great document. It's great because it's clear. It's not great if you're a vendor because it's got like 60 questions and they're not yes or no. And I'm saying to myself, man, if a vendor's got 200 community banks and they start getting this like, hey, fill this out, it's going to be quite a challenge. So, I think there's a continued shakeup. I do hope that the regulators realize that, you got to understand that we have an incumbency situation with some of these providers that if we just make all these other players go away, I don't know if that's a particular good thing. I have heard like Michelle Bowman, she's raised a very interesting point. Maybe rather than having the banks have to do all this due diligence, not have the regulators also examine some of these. And I think for some of these third parties, they might actually find that's better than what I think they're about to get is death by 1,000 requests. I don't know.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jason, for joining me today. This was a great update on my insolvency knowledge and also some topical stuff on third-party risks. So I think our listeners will greatly appreciate your insights. As always, I want to thank our listeners. Without them, we wouldn't have a reason to be here. And I want to thank you as well for joining us today.
Well, thanks for asking, and we'll see you around town.
Yes.